Sarah Mitchell stood at the entrance of the community hall with trembling hands, watching the guests arrive for what was supposed to be her wedding day. The white dress she wore felt heavy, suffocating almost, as if the fabric itself knew this marriage was built on obligation rather than love. Her father had arranged everything with Thomas Brennan, a wealthy ranch owner from the neighboring county. Thomas was 15 years older than Sarah, with cold gray eyes and a voice that never seemed to rise above a monotone. She had met him only 3 times before the wedding was planned. The morning had started with her mother pinning flowers into Sarah's auburn hair while avoiding eye contact. There were no congratulations, no tears of joy, just mechanical movements and silence that spoke louder than words. Her younger sister Emma had hugged her tightly before leaving for the hall, whispering an apology that made Sarah's chest tighten with unshed tears. Everyone in their small Arizona settlement knew this was a transaction. Her father's gambling debts had piled so high that selling his daughter into marriage seemed like the only solution he could find. Thomas arrived late, smelling of whiskey and tobacco. He barely glanced at Sarah as he took his position at the altar. The preacher began his sermon about love and commitment, words that felt like mockery under the circumstances. Sarah's mind drifted to the stories her grandmother used to tell about choosing your own path, about women who refused to be bartered like cattle. But those were just stories, and this was her reality. Halfway through the ceremony, Thomas leaned toward her with breath that reeked of alcohol. He grabbed her wrist with unnecessary force and muttered something crude about their wedding night. Sarah felt her stomach turn. She looked toward her father, hoping for some sign that he would stop this madness, but he stared at the floor with shame etched across his weathered face. Her mother dabbed at dry eyes with a handkerchief, performing grief without actually feeling it. Then Thomas made a mistake that revealed his true nature to everyone present. When the preacher asked if he would honor and cherish his bride, Thomas laughed and said he would honor his new property. The words hung in the air like poison. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Sarah felt something inside her crack, not break entirely, but crack enough to let light through. She realized in that moment that she could not go through with this. Whatever consequences awaited her would be better than a lifetime of being treated like an object. She pulled her wrist free from Thomas's grip and stepped backward. The preacher stopped mid-sentence. Thomas's face darkened with anger. Sarah's father stood up from his seat, panic replacing shame. But before anyone could speak, before anyone could drag her back to the altar, Sarah gathered her skirts and ran. She ran out of the hall, past the shocked faces of neighbors and relatives, past her mother's gasp of horror and her father's shout of fury. Her feet carried her down the dusty main street of the settlement. The wedding shoes pinched her feet, but she did not stop. Behind her, she could hear Thomas bellowing orders, her father's voice joining his in angry pursuit. Sarah knew the settlement well. She had grown up exploring every corner, every hiding spot. She veered left toward the narrow alley between the general store and the blacksmith's shop, then cut through Mrs. Henderson's vegetable garden, earning a startled yelp from the elderly woman. The sun blazed overhead as Sarah ran toward the edge of town where the desert began. She had no plan, no destination, just a desperate need to put distance between herself and that terrible altar. Her lungs burned and sweat dripped down her back, making the heavy dress cling to her skin. She could hear horses now, which meant Thomas and probably her father had mounted up to chase her down. The thought made her run faster despite her exhaustion. Sarah reached the rocky outcropping at the settlement's border, where scraggly juniper trees provided some shade. She scrambled up the rocks, tearing her dress on the sharp edges, not caring about anything except escape. From this vantage point, she could see Thomas and her father riding hard in her direction, along with 2 of Thomas's ranch hands. They were spreading out, trying to cut off any route she might take into the open desert. Her breathing came in ragged gasps as she realized she was trapped. The desert stretched endlessly before her, offering no real shelter or safety. Going back meant submitting to the marriage, becoming Thomas's property as he had so callously put it. Staying here meant being caught within minutes. Sarah closed her eyes and felt tears finally break free, streaming down her cheeks. She had made her stand, shown her defiance, but it seemed the world was determined to push her back into the cage she was trying to escape. That was when she heard it, a low voice, barely above a whisper, speaking from somewhere among the rocks. She could not see anyone, but the words were clear and careful, spoken in English with an accent she recognized as Apache. The voice said just 4 words that made her heart skip a beat. It said words that offered something she thought impossible in that moment. The voice offered her a choice, a real choice, perhaps the first genuine one she had been given in months. The mysterious speaker asked a question that would change everything about the path her life was meant to take. Sarah spun around, searching for the source of the voice among the scattered rocks and twisted juniper branches. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she tried to pinpoint where the speaker was hiding. The Apache people occasionally came near the settlement to trade, though most townspeople treated them with suspicion or outright hostility. She had always been curious about them, drawn to their quiet dignity despite the cruel stories others told. A figure emerged slowly from behind a large boulder about 20 feet away. He was tall and lean, with long black hair tied back and dark eyes that seemed to assess everything in a single glance. He wore traditional Apache clothing mixed with some pieces acquired from traders. What struck Sarah most was not his appearance but the absolute stillness in his movements, as if he belonged to the landscape itself. He raised one hand slowly to show he meant no threat. The sound of horses grew louder. Thomas was shouting her name now, his voice thick with rage. Her father called out too, promising they would talk, that they could work something out, lies meant to lure her back. The Apache man glanced toward the approaching riders, then back at Sarah. His expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes that might have been understanding or perhaps recognition of a shared experience with being hunted. He spoke again in that low, measured voice. He told her his name was Natan, which meant wise in his language. He said he had been gathering medicinal plants in the rocks when he heard her running, heard the desperation in her footsteps. He explained that he lived alone in the mountains, keeping distance from both his own people and hers after circumstances had made him an outsider to both worlds. His next words were deliberate and clear. He said if she wanted to disappear, if she truly meant to escape her fate, he could help her reach places where the men chasing her would never find her. Sarah stared at him, trying to process this unexpected offer. She knew nothing about this man except his name and the fact that he was offering salvation when she had none. The horses were close enough now that she could hear Thomas cursing as he navigated the rocky terrain. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they would round the outcropping and spot her. Natan waited patiently for her response, his dark eyes steady and calm despite the approaching danger. She made her decision in a heartbeat. Sarah nodded and scrambled down from her perch, nearly losing her footing on the loose stones. Natan moved quickly then, grabbing her arm to steady her, then leading her deeper into the rock formation through a narrow passage she had never noticed before. It was barely wide enough for them to squeeze through sideways. The rough stones scraped against her arms and the torn wedding dress, but she pushed forward without complaint. They emerged on the other side into a small hidden canyon that Sarah had never known existed, despite growing up nearby. Natan moved with confident speed now, guiding her along a path that wound between massive boulders and through clusters of desert brush. Behind them, she heard Thomas and the others reach the rocks where she had been moments before. Voices echoed as they searched, calling her name, threatening consequences for her disobedience. Natan led her to a spot where the canyon wall had collapsed ages ago, creating a natural ramp of stone and earth. They climbed quickly, Sarah struggling with her cumbersome dress and impractical shoes. At the top, Natan paused and looked back. The searchers were visible below, spreading out through the rocks, but they had not found the hidden passage. He gestured for silence and they continued along the ridge, keeping low to avoid being silhouetted against the sky. They walked for what felt like hours. The sun climbed higher and the heat became oppressive. Sarah's feet blistered inside the wedding shoes until she finally stopped and tore them off, throwing them aside without regret. Natan noticed but said nothing, simply adjusting his pace slightly to account for her bare feet on the rough ground. He led her through terrain that seemed impassable, finding paths through thorn bush and over stone that only someone who knew this land intimately could navigate. Eventually, they reached a deep arroyo, where a thin stream of water trickled over smooth stones. Natan gestured for her to rest and drink. Sarah collapsed onto the ground, her legs shaking from exhaustion and her throat burning with thirst. She cupped water in her hands and drank deeply, not caring that it was probably not as clean as the well water back home. Nothing had ever tasted better. Natan crouched nearby, watching the direction they had come from with vigilant attention. After several minutes of silence, Sarah found her voice and asked why he was helping her. She wanted to know what he expected in return, what price this rescue would demand. She had learned that nothing came free. especially not for women who broke the rules society set for them. He turned to look at her with those calm, assessing eyes. He told her he expected nothing except perhaps her company for a few days, while he made sure she was safely away from her pursuers. He explained that he had seen many people trapped by circumstances they did not choose, forced into lives that slowly killed their spirits. He said he recognized that look in her eyes when he first saw her among the rocks, the look of someone choosing death over surrender. He could not walk away from that. Sarah felt tears threaten again, but she blinked them back. She asked where they were going, what his plan was. Natan explained there was a place deeper in the mountains where an old friend of his lived, a Mexican woman named Rosa, who had also fled a bad situation years ago. Rosa ran a small trading post that served travelers and occasional Apache visitors. She would offer Sarah shelter while they figured out the next steps. It was 3 days of hard travel, but he knew the way and knew how to avoid being followed. The reality of her situation began to settle over Sarah like a weight. She had just destroyed her entire life in the settlement. Her father would never forgive her for the shame she brought on the family. Thomas would spread stories about her being ungrateful or mad or worse. Her mother and sister would suffer the social consequences of her actions. And here she was, alone in the wilderness with a stranger wearing a ruined wedding dress and no shoes, with nothing but the desperate hope that anything was better than the altar she had fled. Night fell quickly in the desert, bringing cold that seemed impossible after the scorching day. Natan had led them to a sheltered spot beneath an overhanging cliff, where wind could not reach and the stones still held warmth from the sun. He gathered dry brush and wood with practiced efficiency, building a small fire that provided heat and light without creating much smoke that might give away their location. Sarah sat wrapped in a blanket that Natan had pulled from a pack she had not noticed him carrying. He prepared a simple meal of dried meat, flat bread, and some kind of root vegetable that he roasted in the coals. Sarah ate slowly, her stomach unsettled from the day's events but grateful for the food. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the crackling fire and distant coyote calls the only sounds. Sarah studied her companion's face in the flickering light, trying to understand this quiet man who had upended his own plans to help a desperate stranger. Eventually, Natan began to talk, his voice low and measured. He told her his story without prompting, as if he understood she needed to know who had taken responsibility for her safety. He explained that he had been born into the Chiricahua Apache, raised in traditions that were already under assault from expanding settlements and military pressure. His father had been a respected warrior and his mother a skilled healer. He had grown up learning both the old ways and the necessity of adapting to a changing world. When he was 20, his band had been approached by army officers who wanted peace talks. Natan had been chosen as one of the translators because he had learned English from a missionary teacher who briefly lived near their territory. The talks went badly. Miscommunication and distrust on both sides led to violence. Soldiers attacked and his father was killed along with several others. The survivors scattered, some heading deeper into Mexico, others trying to find refuge with different Apache groups. Natan had been blamed by some of his own people for the failed negotiations. They said his translations must have been wrong, that he had betrayed them to the soldiers. The accusations were false, but the damage was done. He could not return to his band without facing continued suspicion and possible violence. At the same time, the army and settlers viewed him as hostile simply for being Apache. He found himself caught between two worlds, welcomed fully by neither. For the past 3 years, he had lived alone in the mountains, surviving through hunting, gathering, and occasional trading with people on the fringes like Rosa. He preferred solitude to the constant tension of trying to belong somewhere he was not wanted. The loneliness was difficult, but it was honest in a way that false belonging never could be. He had made peace with his situation, or so he told himself. Sarah listened without interrupting, understanding now why he had helped her. He recognized the experience of being cast out, of having your place in the world suddenly revoked through circumstances beyond your control. When he finished speaking, she thanked him quietly and began to share her own story. She told him about her father's gambling, about being informed rather than asked about the marriage arrangement, about Thomas Brennan's cold cruelty, and the suffocating sense that her life was being decided by everyone except herself. She described the moment during the ceremony when Thomas called her property, how something fundamental had shifted inside her in that instant. She had realized that being alone and struggling was better than being owned and comfortable. The choice to run had felt less like a decision and more like her body acting on pure survival instinct. Now, sitting by this fire with a stranger who had shown her more respect in a few hours than her own family had in months, she felt simultaneously terrified and strangely at peace. Natan nodded slowly when she finished. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. He said something then that surprised her. He said she was braver than she knew, that running took more courage than staying ever would. Most people, he explained, chose the prison they knew over the freedom they feared. The fact that she had chosen uncertainty over guaranteed misery said something important about her spirit. They talked into the night about smaller things then. Sarah asked about the plants he had been gathering, and Natan explained their medicinal properties with quiet knowledge. She was surprised by how much he knew, how he could identify dozens of plants by sight and describe their uses for healing everything from fevers to wounds. He asked about her life before the marriage arrangement, and she told him about helping her mother with the garden, about reading every book she could get her hands on, about dreams of seeing places beyond the small settlement that had been her entire world. As the fire burned low, Natan showed her how to find the North Star and explained how his people used the stars to navigate at night. Sarah found herself relaxing despite the circumstances, drawn in by his calm presence and the strange comfort of being treated as an equal, rather than a burden or a commodity. When her eyes grew heavy, Natan told her to sleep and promised to keep watch. She wanted to protest that he needed rest too, but exhaustion claimed her before she could form the words. She woke several times during the night, disoriented and briefly panicked before remembering where she was. Each time she saw Natan sitting alert, his eyes scanning the darkness, keeping his promise. The third time she woke, she found he had added wood to the fire and arranged his blanket over her as well, leaving himself with only his jacket against the cold. The gesture touched something deep in her chest, a recognition that genuine kindness existed even in the most unexpected places. Morning came with brilliant light flooding across the desert landscape. Sarah sat up, her body aching from sleeping on the ground, and found Natan already awake and preparing for the day's travel. He had refilled their water containers from a source she had not seen, and had something cooking over a rebuilt fire. He greeted her simply, asking if she had rested well, and offered her food as naturally as if they had known each other for years rather than hours. After they ate, Natan explained the day's route. They would travel mostly through canyons and valleys where they would be hidden from anyone searching from higher ground. The terrain would be rough, but it would keep them safe. He also told her that he had heard voices carried on the wind during the night, searchers calling out, but they were far off and moving in the wrong direction. Still, they needed to be cautious and avoid leaving obvious tracks. The second day of travel proved harder than the first. Sarah's feet, already tender from the previous day's flight, blistered and bled on the rocky ground. She tried to hide her pain, not wanting to slow Natan down or appear weak, but he noticed anyway. He stopped at midday and used strips of cloth from his pack to wrap her feet, applying a paste made from plants he gathered along the way. The paste stung at first, but then brought blessed relief, numbing the worst of the pain. They walked through canyons so narrow that Sarah could touch both walls with her outstretched arms. The high stone walls blocked out much of the sky, creating a twilight world even at noon. Water had carved these passages over countless years, leaving smooth curves and strange formations in the rock. Natan pointed out ancient markings on the walls, symbols left by people who had lived in this harsh land long before either of their peoples arrived. The thought made Sarah feel small but also connected to something larger than her own troubles. That afternoon they encountered a rattlesnake sunning itself on a flat rock directly in their path. Sarah froze, fear locking her muscles, but Natan simply picked up a long stick and gently guided the snake off the path and into the brush. He explained that the snake was just doing what snakes do, seeking warmth and shelter, meaning no harm unless threatened. He said most dangerous things in the desert were only dangerous if you did not respect them and give them space to exist. As evening approached, they climbed out of the canyons onto a high plateau covered with juniper and pinyon pine. The air was cooler here, and Sarah could see mountains rising in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow despite the season. Natan said they would reach Rosa's trading post tomorrow if they maintained good pace. Relief flooded through Sarah at the thought of walls and a roof. of relative safety and the chance to properly rest. They made camp in a grove of trees where a spring bubbled up from the rocks, creating a small pool before disappearing back into the earth. Natan gathered pine nuts from the trees and showed Sarah how to crack them open to reach the meat inside. They tasted rich and slightly sweet, unlike anything she had eaten before. He also caught 2 rabbits with snares he set quickly and efficiently, cooking them over the fire until the meat fell off the bones. That night, with her stomach full and the fire warm, Sarah finally asked the question that had been building in her mind. She asked Natan what he thought she should do after reaching Rosa's place. Should she try to go to another settlement far away and start over? Should she attempt to reach a larger city where she might disappear into a crowd? Should she try to get word to her sister Emma, the only family member she still cared about? Natan was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, his words were careful and thoughtful. He said he could not tell her what to do because her life was her own to shape. But he offered observations based on what he had learned from his own exile. He said settlements always talked and news traveled faster than people expected. Her story would spread, and strangers would know about the runaway bride before she could establish herself anywhere within 100 miles. Cities offered anonymity but required money she did not have and skills she might not possess. They were dangerous places for women alone, full of people ready to exploit desperation. He was not saying she could not survive there, only that the path would be very hard. As for contacting her sister, Natan suggested waiting. Any message sent too soon might help her father or Thomas track her location. Better to let time pass and anger cool before reaching out. Sarah absorbed his words, feeling the weight of impossible choices. She asked what he would do if he were in her position. Natan smiled slightly, the first real smile she had seen from him. He said if he were her, he would probably spend time at Rosa's place, learning what skills he could, saving any money possible from work, and most importantly, taking time to figure out who he wanted to be now that the old life was gone forever. He said transformation required space to breathe and think. Then Natan said something that made Sarah's heart skip. He said he had been thinking during the walk that day, and if she wanted, she could stay in the mountains near where he lived. Rosa often needed help at her trading post and would probably welcome an extra hand. The work would be hard and the life simple, but she would be safe and free to make her own decisions. He would teach her survival skills for the wilderness if she was interested in learning. She would not be alone unless she chose to be. Sarah stared at him, trying to understand if he was offering charity, companionship, or something else entirely. She asked directly why he would want her to stay. Natan met her gaze steadily and gave her an honest answer that surprised her with its vulnerability. He said that in the 3 years of living alone he had convinced himself that solitude was enough, that he preferred it even. But spending these 2 days with her, talking and traveling together, had reminded him what he had been missing. He was not asking for anything romantic or improper, he clarified quickly. He understood she had just escaped one situation where her choices were taken away, and he would never presume to complicate her freedom with unwanted expectations. He was simply saying that her company had been pleasant, and he thought they could both benefit from having someone to talk with occasionally, someone who understood what it meant to be outside society's normal boundaries. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but they were different from the desperate tears of her flight. These were tears of something like gratitude mixed with relief. She told Natan she would think about his offer seriously, that it meant more than he probably knew to be given a choice presented as a true choice, rather than a veiled command. They sat in comfortable silence after that, both lost in their own thoughts while the fire crackled between them. The night grew cold and Sarah wrapped herself in both blankets this time, insisting Natan take back one of them. He accepted with a small nod of thanks. Before she lay down to sleep, Sarah asked one more question. She asked how he had known to offer help that day at the rocks, how he had known she was not just a foolish girl having second thoughts, but someone genuinely in danger. Natan's response was simple. He said he recognized the difference between fear and terror, between hesitation and desperation. He had seen real danger too many times not to know it when he saw it reflected in someone's eyes. Sarah drifted off to sleep, thinking about new possibilities, about a life where she was neither daughter nor property, but simply herself, whatever that might mean. She thought about mountains and trading posts and the strange comfort of this quiet Apache man who had appeared exactly when she needed him most. The future was still terrifying and uncertain, but for the first time since her father announced the marriage arrangement, she felt like the future might actually be hers to shape. The third morning brought them into higher country where the air smelled of pine and distant rain. Sarah's feet had toughened slightly with Natan's continued treatment and the cloth wrappings he maintained. She walked with more confidence now, learning to read the terrain the way he did, anticipating obstacles before reaching them. He noticed her improvement and commented that she was adapting well, that she had natural instincts for the wilderness that some people never developed. Around midday, they crested a ridge and Natan pointed to a valley below where a collection of buildings sat beside a creek. Smoke rose from a chimney and Sarah could see a corral with several horses and mules. The trading post looked weathered but sturdy, built from logs and stone to withstand harsh mountain weather. Relief and nervousness warred in Sarah's chest as they began the descent. This would be her first interaction with anyone besides Natan since her flight, and she worried about how Rosa would react to her sudden appearance. As they approached, a woman emerged from the main building. She was perhaps 50 years old, solidly built with graying black hair tied back in a practical bun. Her face was lined from years of sun and wind, but her dark eyes were sharp and assessing. She called out to Natan in Spanish, greeting him warmly, then switched to English as her gaze fell on Sarah. There was no judgment in her expression, only curiosity and a kind of knowing that suggested she had seen many desperate people arrive at her door over the years. Natan explained the situation in brief, factual terms. He did not embellish or dramatize, simply stated that Sarah had fled an unwanted marriage and needed safe harbor for a time, while she decided her next steps. Rosa listened while studying Sarah with those penetrating eyes, then nodded slowly. She said any friend of Natan's was welcome at her post, and any woman running from bad men even more so. She gestured for them to come inside out of the sun. The interior of the trading post was cluttered but organized, with shelves holding everything from basic supplies to beautiful woven blankets and pottery. A pot of something savory simmered on the stove and fresh bread cooled on a table. Rosa directed Sarah to sit and poured her coffee from a battered pot, then did the same for Natan. The hot, bitter liquid tasted wonderful after days of only water. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she held the cup, the reality of her situation catching up with her now that immediate survival was no longer consuming all her attention. Rosa, and Natan spoke in low tones in a mixture of Spanish and Apache that Sarah could not follow. She caught her own name several times and saw Rosa nod at various points. Finally, Rosa turned to Sarah and switched back to English. She said Sarah could stay as long as needed in exchange for helping around the post. There was always work to do, from cooking and cleaning to helping with customers and maintaining the buildings. Rosa would teach her what she needed to know, and in return, Sarah would have a safe place and wages when the post turned profit. Sarah accepted immediately, her voice thick with gratitude. Rosa waved off her thanks with a rough kindness, saying every woman deserved a chance to build her own life. Then Rosa's expression grew more serious. She explained that the trading post got visitors from various groups including occasional settlers, Apache traders, Mexican travelers, and even Army Scouts sometimes. Sarah would need a new name and a simple story to explain her presence. The truth would only bring trouble. They decided Sarah would go by Sarah Delgado, claiming to be Rosa's niece from Mexico, who had come to help with the business after Rosa's fictional sister passed away. The story was simple enough to remember, and believable enough not to raise suspicions. Rosa took Sarah to a small room at the back of the post that contained a bed, a trunk, and a small window looking out at the mountains. She said this would be Sarah's space, her own private place where she could close the door on the world when needed. After Rosa left to attend to some tasks, Natan lingered in the doorway. He asked if Sarah was all right, if she felt safe here. Sarah assured him she did and thanked him again for everything he had done. She asked if he would visit sometimes or if this was where they would part ways. Natan smiled that slight smile of his and said his camp was only a few hours' walk into the mountains. He came to trade with Rosa every few weeks anyway, so she would see him again soon if she wanted to. Before leaving, Natan told her something important. He said the next weeks and months would be difficult as she processed everything that had happened and figured out who she was outside the roles others had assigned her. There would be days when she questioned whether she made the right choice, when the safety of her old life, even with all its problems, seemed preferable to the uncertainty of the new one. He said those thoughts were normal and did not mean she had made a mistake. He said healing and transformation took time. Sarah watched from her window as Natan said goodbye to Rosa and headed back into the mountains. She felt a strange ache watching him go, as if she was losing something important even though she knew she would see him again. He had been her lifeline, her guide through impossible circumstances, and now she had to learn to stand without his steady presence beside her. It was both frightening and necessary. Rosa put Sarah to work immediately, which Sarah later realized was an act of kindness. Staying busy left less time to spiral into worry and regret. Sarah learned to grind corn for tortillas, to maintain the trading post's inventory, to recognize and value the goods people brought to trade. Rosa was a patient but firm teacher who expected competence and rewarded effort. She shared stories of her own past sparingly, enough for Sarah to understand that Rosa too had fled a bad situation many years ago, though she never gave specific details. The trading post attracted interesting visitors. Sarah met Apache families who came to trade dried meat and beautiful basketwork for supplies they could not make themselves. She met Mexican traders who brought goods up from the south and told stories of places Sarah had only read about. She met prospectors and hunters and wanderers, each with their own stories of why they were out here far from settled civilization. She learned to read people quickly, to sense who was trustworthy and who bore watching. Rosa taught her to keep a rifle within reach at all times and how to use it if necessary. Sarah discovered she had a good eye for shooting, perhaps because fear had made her focus absolutely on learning skills that might save her life. Rosa nodded approvingly when Sarah hit the targets they set up, saying good skills and good sense were a woman's best protection in this world. Weeks passed and Sarah began to feel something she had not experienced in a long time. She began to feel capable. Every task she mastered, every challenge she met, built a foundation of confidence that her old life had systematically denied her. She learned her own strength, her own intelligence, her own worth without it being filtered through others' opinions and judgments. The work was hard but honest, and at night she fell into bed exhausted but satisfied in a way she never had when her biggest concern was arranging flowers or practicing piano as accomplishments meant to attract a suitable husband. Natan visited as promised, arriving every few weeks with furs to trade or plants to sell to Rosa for her medicinal supplies. He and Sarah would talk for hours, sharing observations about their respective solitudes and the strange freedom of living outside normal society. He taught her to identify edible plants and track animals. She taught him some of what she remembered from her books, sharing stories and ideas that made him laugh or think deeply. Their friendship grew in comfortable, unhurried ways, built on mutual respect and understanding. 3 months into her new life, trouble arrived at the trading post in the form of 2 men from Sarah's settlement. They came ostensibly to trade, but Rosa, who had sharp instincts for these things, immediately sensed their real purpose. She sent Sarah to work in the back storage room while she dealt with the visitors. Through the thin walls, Sarah heard the men asking if Rosa had seen a young woman matching Sarah's description, claiming she was a mentally unstable relative who had wandered off and whose family was desperate to find her. Rosa, without missing a beat, told them she had seen no such person and suggested they try the mining camps to the north, where lost souls often ended up. Her tone was helpful but firm, brooking no suspicion that she might be lying. The men persisted for a while, offering a reward for information, but Rosa remained consistent in her story. Eventually they left, but not before one of them mentioned they would be checking with other homesteads and camps in the area. Sarah felt sick with fear, realizing Thomas or her father had not given up the search. That evening, Rosa told Sarah she needed to be more careful. The men would likely spread word about the missing woman, and someone might eventually make the connection despite the name change and cover story. Rosa suggested Sarah stay close to the post for a while and avoid being visible when unfamiliar customers arrived. Sarah agreed, but felt the walls of her new freedom closing in slightly. Word was sent to Natan through a trusted Apache trader who passed through the next day. He arrived at the post within hours of receiving the message, his face tight with concern. After hearing the full story, Natan made a suggestion that surprised both women. He said Sarah could come stay at his camp in the mountains for a while, at least until the searchers moved on to other areas. His place was remote enough that no one would stumble across it accidentally, and he could teach her more advanced survival skills while they waited for the danger to pass. Sarah hesitated, not because she distrusted Natan, but because she worried about propriety and what such an arrangement might imply. Natan addressed her unspoken concern directly. He said he would build her a separate shelter near his own, that they would live as neighbors helping each other. Nothing more unless she ever decided she wanted differently. His directness and respect for her autonomy made the decision easier. Rosa agreed it was the safest option and promised to send word when the coast was clear. Sarah packed her few belongings and followed Natan into the mountains the next morning. They traveled for most of the day, climbing higher into terrain that grew increasingly rugged and beautiful. His camp was situated in a hidden valley surrounded by tall pines, with a clear stream running through it and a view of distant peaks that took Sarah's breath away. His shelter was simple but well constructed, designed to withstand harsh weather while remaining nearly invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. True to his word, Natan immediately began constructing a second shelter for Sarah, about 50 yards from his own. He showed her how to select the right materials, how to weave branches and secure hides to create walls that kept out wind and rain. Sarah worked alongside him, learning through doing, and within 3 days she had her own small but comfortable home. She felt proud looking at the structure, knowing her own hands had built it with Natan's guidance. Life in the mountain camp followed rhythms dictated by necessity and seasons rather than arbitrary social rules. Sarah learned to set snares and check them at dawn. She learned which berries were safe to eat and which would make her sick. Natan taught her to read weather signs in the clouds and wind, to find her way using landmarks and the sun's position. He showed her how to preserve meat by smoking it, and how to tan hides so they stayed soft and useful. Every skill felt like adding another tool to her personal arsenal of independence. The days developed an easy routine. They would work separately on individual tasks, then come together for the evening meal, sharing what they had gathered or caught. They talked about everything and nothing, their conversations ranging from practical matters to philosophical discussions about freedom, belonging, and the nature of home. Natan shared more stories of his people's traditions, teachings about living in balance with the land rather than trying to conquer it. Sarah shared what she knew from books, creating mental worlds for him filled with faraway places and different ways of living. One evening, about 2 weeks into her stay at the camp, Sarah asked Natan something that had been on her mind. She asked if he ever got lonely living like this, if he ever wanted to find a wife and have a family like most people did. Natan was quiet for a long time, poking at the fire with a stick. Finally, he said he had wanted those things once, before circumstances made him an outcast. He had been promised to a woman in his band, someone he had known since childhood and cared for deeply. When he was blamed for the failed peace talks, she had been forbidden to marry him. Last he heard, she had married someone else and moved away with another group. Sarah heard the old pain in his voice and asked gently if he still loved the woman. Natan shook his head slowly. He said he had loved who she was in his memory, but that version of her and that version of himself no longer existed. Time and experience had changed them both into different people. He said he had made peace with the probability that he would live and die alone, that his bloodline would end with him. It was a sad reality, but not an unbearable one. Then Natan looked at Sarah with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something vulnerable and uncertain. He said that was all true until recently. He said her presence in his life had awakened possibilities he thought were closed forever. He was not speaking of immediate expectations or pressure, but simply acknowledging that for the first time in years, he could imagine a future that included genuine companionship, perhaps even partnership if circumstances and feelings aligned naturally over time. Sarah's heart beat faster as she processed his words. She realized her own feelings had been shifting over the months since they met. The man who had saved her at her lowest moment had become her teacher, her friend, and gradually something more. She appreciated his honesty about his growing feelings while maintaining his commitment to letting her make her own choices. It was such a stark contrast to Thomas's presumptuous ownership and her father's disregard for her wishes. She told Natan she needed time to sort through her feelings, that she was still discovering who she was as an independent person, and did not want to move from one defined role directly into another, even one that looked very different on the surface. Natan nodded with understanding and said time was something they had plenty of, that there was no urgency or deadline. They could simply continue as they were, letting whatever might develop do so naturally without force or expectation. A month passed in the mountain camp, and Sarah felt herself changing in fundamental ways. The softness of her old life gave way to lean muscle from constant physical work. Her hands, once carefully tended, became calloused and strong. Her mind, once focused on pleasing others and meeting social expectations, became sharp and self-directed. She made decisions daily about how to spend her time and energy, decisions no one questioned or overrode. The freedom was intoxicating and sometimes overwhelming, but always precious. News came through Rosa's messenger that the searchers had moved on, heading north based on a false lead someone had given them about a woman matching Sarah's description, working at a mine camp. It seemed safe for Sarah to return to the trading post if she wanted. Rosa sent word that she missed Sarah's help and company, making clear the offer to return stood whenever Sarah was ready. The message created an unexpected dilemma for Sarah, who realized she was not sure she wanted to leave the mountain camp. Sarah sat by the stream near camp, Rosa's message in her hand, wrestling with a choice that was entirely her own to make. She could return to the trading post where she had steady work, Rosa's companionship and connection to the wider world such as it was. Or she could stay here in the mountains where life was harder but somehow felt more authentic, where Natan's quiet presence had become central to her sense of peace and possibility. Neither choice was wrong, which made the decision both liberating and difficult. She thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, standing at that altar in a dress that felt like a shroud. That Sarah would never have believed she could survive alone in the wilderness, build her own shelter or provide for her own needs. That Sarah had defined herself entirely through relationships to others, daughter, sister, future wife. This new Sarah knew her own capabilities and was still discovering more. She had learned the profound difference between loneliness and solitude, between isolation forced upon you and privacy chosen for yourself. That evening she told Natan she wanted to stay in the mountains but suggested they visit Rosa together sometimes, to trade and maintain connections. She was not choosing isolation, but rather choosing to build her life from this place with him as her neighbor and friend. Natan's face showed relief and something deeper, though he simply nodded and said that sounded like a good plan. He added that they should build her shelter sturdier before winter came, make it a real home rather than temporary shelter. They worked together over the following weeks to improve both shelters. Natan showed Sarah how to think ahead about winter needs, how much firewood to stockpile, how to store food so it would last through months of cold. They hunted together and Sarah's shooting improved until she could bring down a deer cleanly. She learned to butcher and preserve the meat without waste, using every part of the animal as Natan's people traditionally did. The work was hard and sometimes bloody, but it was honest and she felt connected to the cycle of life in ways her old existence had never allowed. One cool evening in early autumn, as they sat by the fire after a long day of work, Natan asked Sarah a question that had clearly been building in his mind. He asked what she wanted from life now, what her dreams were for the future beyond simple survival. It was a question no one had ever asked her before. Her father had dreams for her. Thomas had expectations of her, but her own dreams had never been considered worth exploring. Sarah thought carefully before answering. She said she wanted to continue learning, to become truly competent at living in harmony with this land. She wanted to help people when she could, perhaps by sharing what she was learning with others who needed to escape bad situations. She mentioned that she sometimes thought about writing down the stories of people like Rosa and Natan and herself, people who lived in the margins but whose lives were rich with meaning and struggle. Mostly, though, she wanted to wake up each morning and make choices that were hers, building a life that felt authentic rather than performed for an audience. Natan listened carefully and then shared his own evolving dreams. He said he had long ago given up on the idea of having a family or leaving any legacy beyond his own existence. But lately he had been thinking about what two people who understood each other might build together if they chose to. Not following traditional paths that neither of them quite fit, but creating something new that honored both their backgrounds while serving their present needs. He said he could imagine a life built around partnership and mutual respect, around shared work and separate spaces, around companionship without possession. Sarah understood he was offering not just philosophy but possibility. She felt her heart respond to the vision he was painting, a relationship built on foundations she had not known existed during her brief, terrible engagement to Thomas. But she also felt fear, worry that she was not done discovering herself, that she might lose the independence she had fought so hard to gain. She voiced these fears honestly, and Natan received them without defensiveness. He said something then that settled her worry like a stone finding its place in a clear stream. He said loving someone should make them more themselves, not less. If being with him ever made her feel smaller or less free, then they would be doing it wrong and should stop. He wanted whatever they built together to be a place where both of them could grow, rather than a cage that protected at the cost of diminishment. He said marriage in the traditional sense was not what he was suggesting anyway, as neither of them fit traditional molds. He was talking about partnership, about choosing each other daily rather than being bound by ceremonies and papers. Sarah felt something release in her chest, some final guard she had been holding against complete vulnerability. She told Natan she was not ready to make formal commitments or declarations, but she was ready to stop pretending her feelings were only friendly. She cared for him deeply and could imagine building something meaningful together, if they continued being honest with each other about their needs and fears. Natan smiled genuinely, the kind of smile that transformed his usually serious face, and said that was more than enough for now. The months that followed brought them closer through shared work and honest conversation. They maintained separate shelters but spent most evenings together, their comfort with each other deepening into something that felt inevitable in the best sense. When winter came hard and early, bringing snow that blocked the high passes, they were prepared with full stores and tight shelters. The isolation was complete but never felt lonely. They taught each other things during the long winter evenings, him sharing oral traditions and survival wisdom, her sharing what she remembered from books and adding her own observations about their life together. Spring arrived with rushing meltwater and returning birds, and with it came a surprise visitor. Rosa made the journey to their camp, bringing news that Thomas Brennan had died in a winter accident, kicked by a horse and never recovering from his injuries. Sarah felt strange about the news, not glad exactly, but aware that one source of potential danger had been removed from her life. Rosa also brought word that Sarah's sister Emma had married a kind man from a neighboring settlement and was reportedly happy. Rosa had made contact through careful channels to let Emma know Sarah was alive and well, but could not return. More importantly, Rosa brought a question. She was getting older, and the trading post was becoming harder to manage alone. She wondered if Sarah and Natan would consider taking over the post eventually, running it together while Rosa retired to a small house she could build nearby. It would mean more contact with the outside world, but also more opportunity to help others and make a sustainable living. The offer included equal partnership and ownership if they agreed. Sarah and Nathan discussed the offer seriously over several days. They walked the mountain trails they had come to know so well, weighing what they would gain and lose. Eventually, they decided to accept, seeing it as a way to maintain their independence while also contributing something useful to the scattered community of people who relied on the trading post. They would spend summers at the post and winters here in their mountain camp, keeping both lives rather than choosing between them. The trading post under their management became known as a safe place, somewhere people could come without judgment regardless of their backgrounds or circumstances. Sarah's natural empathy and Natan's quiet strength created an atmosphere of respect and safety. They helped several women over the years who came to them desperate, offering the same kind of assistance Natan had first offered Sarah. Word spread carefully among those who needed to know that there was a place in the mountains where starting over was possible. Years passed, and Sarah reflected often on the person she had been on her abandoned wedding day. That frightened girl in the ridiculous dress seemed like a different person entirely, though Sarah carried gratitude for her courage in running. Everything good in her present life had grown from that single desperate choice to refuse the life others had planned for her. She had learned that freedom was not the absence of difficulty but the presence of choice, not the lack of connection, but the ability to form connections based on genuine feeling rather than obligation. She never regretted the life she had built in the mountains with Natan, never looked back with longing at the settlement she had fled. They never had a traditional wedding but committed to each other in their own ceremony one autumn evening, speaking vows they had written themselves about respect and growth and choosing each other daily. It was witnessed only by Rosa and the mountains, which seemed fitting for two people who had always existed on the edges of conventional society. Their life was not easy, and not without struggles. They faced harsh winters and dangerous animals and occasional difficult people, but they faced these challenges together as true partners, both of them transformed by the experience of being seen and valued for who they actually were rather than who others needed them to be. Sarah often thought about that moment in the rocks when a quiet voice had asked if she would stand with him. She had said yes then without knowing what it would mean. Now, years later, she understood it had been an invitation not just to escape but to live, fully and freely in whatever form that life might take.